In the shadowed corners of America's bustling cities, a hidden empire began to rise, a world of power, secrecy, and ruthless ambition. From humble beginnings, the Italian-American Mafia transformed into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. Born in the streets of New York, they built their empire on bootlegging, gambling, and the art of intimidation. But this was more than just organized crime. It was a brotherhood bound by a strict code of loyalty and silence. Our journey will uncover the rise and fall of notorious figures, from the brutal wars that divided them to the alliances that reshaped the underworld. This is the story of a man, dubbed Lucky Luciano, who forever changed America's criminal landscape, forging a legacy that remains as intriguing and complex as it was deadly. Organized crime is a group of individuals partaking in illegal business dealings. Some of you may be wondering why people would willingly partake in illegal activity. The reasons are the same as almost anything: money. People are sometimes dragged into the business via extortion or family, but others will join because of the masses of money in organized crime. The benefits of working in a mafia range in different forms of protection. Organized crime is set up to stealthily do business without any government or foreign entity interference in any way possible. Since there are so few hoops to jump through, there's an incentive to keep the prices low. If there is any competition in the market, the crime unit will remove it from the face of the earth or simply absorb it into their own unit. In 1897, Salvatore Luciano was born in a small sulfur mining town in Sicily called Leccara Friuli. He was the son of Antonio Luciana and Rosalia Caffarella and had four other siblings. In 1906, when Luciano was 9 years old, he and his family would emigrate to New York City. Luciano had a rough childhood, exposed to violence and crime. His family lived in Lower East Side in poverty. Luciano's inability to speak English hindered his education. Not being able to do well in school, he dropped out and found a stable income vending hats, among other things. Lucky would come to realize that there were easier and faster ways to make money than simply being a hat seller if you were willing to break the law. During these early years, Luciano would be controlled by his id to make irrational decisions. As an impatient teenager, he would rather do things fast than do things right, which is the perfect segue into a life of crime. The teenage Luciano would eventually befriend Jewish gang members Meyer Lansky and his associate Bugsy Siegel. Those two men would become two of Luciano's most important allies. In 1916, Luciano, along with Myers Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, got involved in dealing drugs, which led to his first major run-in with the law. He was caught selling heroin and served 6 months at a reformatory for his crime. It was a slap on the wrist compared to his later run-ins with the law. In 1920, the United States declared war, not on foreign soil, but on American bars, taverns, and speakeasies. Prohibition had arrived, transforming alcohol from a social pastime into an illicit treasure. The government saw it as a moral crusade, but for young men like Charles Lucky Luciano, it was something different, an opportunity. Millions of Americans still craved to drink, and criminals were ready to fill their glasses, at a price. Organized crime was about to boom, evolving from a small-time street gang operation into a highly organized empire fueled by illegal liquor. This was the era of speakeasies, hidden behind closed doors, roaring 20s jazz, and criminals who would become folk heroes. But for Luciano, this wasn't just about making money. Born in Sicily and raised in a tough New York immigrant neighborhood, he had grown up feeling the sharp edges of poverty and prejudice. In his mind, prohibition wasn't only an opportunity for profit, it was a path to power, respect, and a way to prove he was no longer powerless as he once was as a boy. To him, power meant safety and control in a world that had shown him little kindness. At this point, Luciano was still a street hustler in New York, a young man who had yet to reach the top. But prohibition set the stage for a new kind of criminal network, one that could both bring wealth and status. Luciano was watching closely, ready to seize his chance and transform himself into something more. A man who controlled not only his own fate but the lives of those around him. This was his ticket to a legacy, and for him, it was about far more than the money.
By the early 1920s, the streets of New York were changing. Prohibition had sparked a surge in illegal profits, and those with ambition and grit could make a name for themselves. For Salvatore Lucky Luciano, it was time to step out of the shadows. With a sharp mind and a hunger for power, Luciano joined the ranks of Joe Mazzaria, a fearsome figure in New York's underworld. Mazzaria ran one of the city's most ruthless crime families, and he saw potential in the young Luciano. In time, Luciano would rise to become his chief lieutenant, managing the family's lucrative ventures in bootlegging, prostitution, and narcotics. But with power came danger. Luciano's success made him a target, and in October 1925, that danger became terrifyingly real. On a chilly night, he was abducted by unknown assailants, beaten, stabbed, and tortured. Dumped on a desolate beach in Staten Island, Luciano was left for dead. Somehow, against odds, he survived. When he returned, scarred and defiant, the underworld began to call him Lucky, a man who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. This brutal attack only strengthened his resolve and cemented his reputation as a survivor. Luciano would never forget that night, and from then on, his climb to power was unstoppable. The event also changed his psyche. He became more calculated and more embracing of the use of violence.
In the late 1920s, tensions among New York's criminal underworld were boiling over. Two powerful factions led by Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano were locked into a brutal struggle for control. This conflict would come to be known as the Castello-Marchese War. On April 15, 1931, the tide would turn. Joe Masseria met Lucky Luciano at a Coney Island restaurant, but Luciano had planned for a betrayal. Stepping out for a moment, he signaled his associates Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel to make their move. Masseria was gunned down in cold blood, and his reign over New York's criminal underworld came to a violent end. Only months later, on September 10th, Luciano turned his sights on Maranzano, who had tried to cement his power by naming himself the boss of all bosses. Luciano saw this as a threat to his vision of a more unified crime organization. Luciano arranged for 4 Jewish gunmen, recruited all by his ally Myers Lansky, to infiltrate Maranzano's office. The ambush was swift and brutal. Maranzano was no more, and Luciano was now held the reins of New York's criminal underworld. In the aftermath, Luciano implemented a groundbreaking change. He formed the Commission, a governing body designed to settle disputes and maintain order among America's crime families, ensuring cooperation over bloodshed. This was the birth of the organized crime as a true syndicate. With the formation of the Commission, Luciano would shape the future of organized crime, establishing a legacy that would impact generations.
By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano became one of the most powerful crime bosses in America. But with power came scrutiny, and few were as determined to bring him down as New York's relentless prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey, who would stop at nothing. In 1936, Dewey brought Luciano to trial, accusing him of running a massive prostitution ring. Luciano fought back, but Dewey's case was airtight, with witness testimony and a mountain of evidence. Dewey finally managed to secure a conviction. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, a stunning downfall for a man who once ruled New York's underworld. But Luciano's story wasn't over. In the early 1940s, the United States was deep into World War II, and fears of sabotage along New York's waterfront were growing. The Navy knew they needed control over the ports to protect against enemy threats, and they reached out to an unlikely ally, Lucky Luciano. Even behind bars, Luciano still had influence. Working with the Navy, he ensured the waterfront was secure, using his connections to prevent any threats from foreign agents. This cooperation did not go unnoticed. His 1946, his sentence was commuted in recognition of his efforts during the war, but there was a catch. Luciano wouldn't walk free on American soil. Instead, he was deported to his birthplace in Sicily, banished from the country he had once ruled. Back in New York, a new order was emerging. Vito Genovese, a longtime associate of Luciano, was named underboss. With Luciano gone, the family's power dynamics began to shift, and a new chapter in the American Mafia was about to unfold.
While Lucky Luciano's deportation had reshaped the underworld, his former underboss, Vito Genovese, was also facing problems of his own. In 1937, Genovese was charged with murder, a crime that threatened to unravel his carefully built influence. Knowing the consequences if he stayed, he fled to Sicily, leaving behind the New York empire he had helped shape. For Genovese, retreat was not easy. His ambition ran deep, and exile only intensified his desire to reclaim what he saw as rightfully his. In his absence, Frank Costello stepped in as acting boss. Unlike his more ruthless peers, Costello was known for his rational approach and his preference for peace over violence. Dubbed the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Costello understood that true power lay not in brute force, but in influence and connections. His calm demeanor and diplomatic style allowed him to forge alliances with politicians and law enforcement, securing the family's interest without resorting to open conflict. Under Costello's leadership, the family remained strong throughout the chaotic years of World War II, a testament to his belief that stability was as valuable as well. When the war ended, Genovese saw a chance to return to the United States and reclaim his position. In 1946 he returned, driven by a restless ambition and unwilling to accept Costello's authority. But much had changed. Costello's steady hand was not only preserved by the family's strength, but had earned him respect and loyalty within the organization. Genovese found himself on the outside, watching as Costello's influence continued to grow. This ate at Genovese, whose belief in power through dominance contrasted sharply with Costello's diplomatic approach. But Vito Genovese was not a man to accept defeat easily. His relentless ambition and ruthless nature would not be silenced. In 1957 he took a drastic action, orchestrating an assassination attempt on Costello in a final bid to seize control. Although Costello survived the attempt, the psychological toll was severe. He had long feared that his approach, favoring peace and diplomacy, would make him more vulnerable to aggressive rivals. The attempt on his life confirmed his worst fears. Realizing he no longer had the will to face the escalating violence and mistrust, Costello stepped down as boss, effectively handing the title to Genovese. With Costello out of the picture, Genovese finally claimed the position he had pursued for years. But in doing so, he inherited not only the power he craved, but a fractured organization and an underworld far less stable than the one Costello had maintained. For Genovese, victory came at a cost, as he took control of a legacy built on peace and transformed it into one marked by fear and bloodshed.
Though deported to Sicily, Lucky Luciano wasn't ready to fade into obscurity. His greed for power was too great. In 1946, he secretly relocated to Havana, Cuba, a tropical refuge just beyond America's reach. From this base, Luciano resumed his work in the shadows, establishing a network to smuggle drugs into the United States, a new and profitable venture that kept his influence alive. Luciano's presence in Cuba didn't go unnoticed for long. The U.S. government had been monitoring his activities, and the narcotics bureau grew concerned as drugs began flowing more freely into American cities. Determined to curb Luciano's operations, the U.S. pressured Cuba to take action. By 1947, the Cuban government was under significant pressure to rid themselves of this notorious exile. Facing a crackdown, Luciano was forced to leave Havana and was sent back to Italy, marking the end of his Caribbean chapter. But even from across the ocean, Luciano's reach and his legacy would endure. In the years following his return to Italy, Lucky Luciano's vision of an organized, structured mafia continued to influence the American underworld. By 1957, his ideals had taken root, and Vito Genovese, now head of Luciano's former family, decided it was time to bring together the nation's top crime bosses for a historic meeting. Letting his id run wild, he invited national crime bosses to a secret meeting. 60 men, each representing crime families from across the country, gathered at a secluded home in Appalachia, New York. The meeting was meant to reinforce alliances, discuss territories, and address shared business interests. But secrecy was hard to maintain with so many influential figures in one place. The New York State Police, noticing a suspicious number of luxury cars in the rural area, moved in. Chaos erupted as the bosses scrambled to escape, darting into the surrounding woods and fields in an attempt to avoid capture. Police managed to detain many of the fleeing men, exposing the reach of the Mafia like never before. The Appalachian meeting became a national scandal, revealing to the American public just how deep the Mafia's roots ran. From that day forward, law enforcement scrutiny intensified, and the myth of a secret society ruling from the shadows was no longer just a rumor.
Luciano's empire and the Mafia in general are both very psychoanalytically intriguing for those reasons. As previously stated, the Mafia's purpose is to have a monopoly on the market, while simultaneously keeping prices favorable. The fact that the people within the mob feel the necessity to have no one against them reveals a deep-rooted insecurity that isn't balanced out by the ego. They desire to be the center of attention in the market, and everybody has to go with them, a property heavily influenced by the id. The reason why many Mafia TV shows and movies show violence, torture, and murdering is not an effort to simply keep the attention of the audience, but rather because it is a very prevalent thing within the mob. The desire to be the center of attention is so great that they are willing to extort and even physically harm others to remain in charge.
On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano's life came to an abrupt end. While waiting for a flight at Capodichino Airport in Naples, he suffered a heart attack, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt the shadows of organized crime for decades. Even with all the power he possessed, he still was taken down by a heart condition. He had come a long way from an impatient teenager to a calculated mob boss, hardened by the mental capacities required to lead a successful crime unit. Luciano was buried in St. John's Cathedral Cemetery in Queens, New York, a final resting place that marked the end of an era. Meanwhile, Vito Genovese continued to lead the family he had fought so hard to control, but even he could not escape the inevitable, passing away from natural causes in prison. The landscape of organized crime was changing, and the U.S. government was ready to strike back. In 1970, Congress passed the Organized Criminal Control Act, a landmark piece of legislation that targeted the very heart of organized crime. A central feature of this act was the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations section. For law enforcement, RICO became a powerful tool, enabling them to prosecute individuals for participating in a continuing pattern of criminal behavior. As the law took effect, the ramifications were swift and severe. The bosses of all 5 Cosa Nostra crime families in New York City were apprehended, each receiving prison terms of at least 100 years. This monumental crackdown dealt a staggering blow to the organized crime syndicate, shaking the very foundations Luciano had helped to establish. According to the FBI, U.S. organized crime activity generated an annual income between $50 and $90 billion, more than any major national industry. Luciano's dream of a powerful, unified mafia continued to linger, but the tide was turning, and law enforcement was finally making headway against the shadowy world he once dominated. While working on this documentary, I learned a lot about the 1920s and 1930s, particularly the power that the Mafia had during this time. I found it very interesting to learn about some of the different crime bosses like Lucky Luciano and Joe Mazzarella. Luciano's story was very interesting to learn about. He went from a 9-year-old immigrant to being the biggest crime boss in the United States. I will say I think Luciano's story would be a lot more different if he did not struggle in school due to the lack of English comprehension. To me, that played a big role in him getting involved in crime. Making money through crime is not sustainable, and that led to Luciano's inevitable downfall. All around, I had a lot of fun working on the documentary with James and Auden, and I feel as though I learned a lot more about history.
What I really enjoyed about this project, besides filming scenes and acting out certain events, was just being able to do my own research. I really enjoy just being able to research and create, another documentary, kind of inspired by the ones that really got me into the subject and that I really enjoyed.
My research about the Italian American Mafia had built the groundwork for a topic that I had always talked about, but I'd never really known about. So I heard about Prohibition, I heard about Lucky Luciano, and other significant people in the Mafia, but it was never really clear what actually happened.